So with that, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Johnathan Michael Square, who I'm very excited and honored to have here today. I've been following him on several social media platforms for a while, and I encourage you to do so too. Dr. Johnathan Michael Square is Assistant Professor of Black Visual Culture at Parsons School of Design. He earned a PhD from New York University, an MA from the University of Texas at Austin, and a BA from Cornell University. Previously, he has taught in the Committee on Degree in History and Literature at Harvard and was a fellow at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Most recently, he curated the exhibition Past is Present, Black Artists Respond to the Complicated Histories of Slavery at the Heron School of Art and Design, which closed in January 2023. He's currently preparing for his upcoming show titled Almost Unknown, Afric-American Picture Gallery at the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library. He also leads the digital humanities project Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, which is how you will find him on social media. And I wanted to have him here to talk about how African Americans interpreted and communicated their identity through the adversities and hardships and perseverance and expressing themselves despite the oppression and the rules against them. Is that somebody's phone telling them what to do? Is that my phone telling me what to do? Sorry. Anyway, so I really thought that Dr. Square would be the perfect person to do this. I wasn't able to find a garment made by an African-American dressmaker or one of the extremely rare surviving pieces of what was worn during slavery by the enslaved to kind of communicate that. So he is here to fill that gap, and I welcome him here. Thank you. Just doing some microphone things.
Great. Okay, perfect.
All right, and there's your.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Let me just start my timer. Good morning. Can you hear me? Is this mic working? Okay. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you, Alden, for that introduction. And I want to thank Alden and the rest of the AR team for welcoming me here. I'm super excited to share my research with you all, and I look forward to hearing any comments, critiques, suggestions, references. So I'm just gonna jump right in. So let me see how this works. I really appreciate that we're starting with the experience of enslaved people for the symposium, because people that are often marginalized to the narrative are actually quite central to the narrative. And so I really appreciate us starting with the experience of enslaved people. So what I'm presenting today is a chapter in progress from a book manuscript. The title of the book is Negro Cloth, How Enslaved People Birthed the American Fashion Industry. The book is under contract with Duke University Press. Not exactly sure when it's coming out. Hopefully in the next 2 years. It's pretty much written, but this is the first chapter in the book, and I start with Negro cloth, and specifically a type of Negro cloth called Lowell cloth that was manufactured in Lowell, Massachusetts. So I'm going to jump right into my talk. Is there a way I can make this darker so I can see the text on the screen?
Please hold.
Okay. Yeah, make it a little easier to read. Oh, sure. Yeah, that works.
Does that look better to you? Let's see.
I'm still struggling to see it without my glasses. Is there a way to like expand it a little bit? I do like the presenter view though. Oh, okay, yeah, that helps.
Oh, but that
Okay.
Hey, everyone. Let's try. Turn off my
Sorry,
light.
my eyesight is so bad.
You know what? Let's try this. The way to make the text on the computer.
Well, you know what I could do? I can just look at this screen right here as opposed to looking at this screen. I can read that.
All right. Oh, wait,
Yeah.
let me try. Okay. Oh, what if I? Oh no, that's worse.
It's okay. I'll just read the
Read the. Okay.
yeah, I'll read the screen.
All right,
Yeah.
Troubleshooting.
Sorry about that. So the first figure that we're going to focus on is Mariah Schneider. The title of this talk is a quote from an oral testimony of Mariah Schneider, a formerly enslaved woman who was interviewed at age 89 in the 1930s. She vividly described the relentless toil in cotton fields and grueling work at the cotton gin. Wearing low cloth was also integral to her experience as an enslaved person. This talk will delve into the historical background of this textile and examine how it influenced the experiences of enslaved individuals in the American South, highlighting its connections to the broader histories of American textile production and global capitalism. Sure. Oh. Maybe I can. Maybe I'll hold it. How about that? All right. Sorry about that. This lectern is a bit low for me. In this talk, I read enslaved people's experiences with textiles as texts. Using oral testimonies and published slave narratives, I examine how the lives of enslaved people were intricately intertwined with the textiles that they wore and crafted. Without regular access to the press or governmental authorities, enslaved individuals conveyed the realities of their enslavement by sharing their tangible experiences with Lowell Cloth. Despite their circumscribed agency, textiles and self-fashioning more broadly became a potential instrument of empowerment. Though enslaved, so let me just take a short break right there. This is something that I often tell my students, that you can read textiles the same way that you can read a text. So, I was trained as a historian, and as historians, we tend to put a lot of primacy on written documents, on archival methodologies, but I think there's also a lot of important information embedded in textiles. In the same way that you can read a text, you can read a textile. So much so that text and textile have the same Latin root. Though enslaved people were able to use textiles to challenge the hierarchies of enslavement and express their multifarious identities, enslaved people occasionally found themselves subject to sumptuary laws designed to maintain their subjugation. Starting in the 18th century, sumptuary laws in North America were implemented to define acceptable attire for enslaved people, a practice that has origins in medieval Europe and earlier. Sumptuary laws and the regulation of dress for enslaved people during the 18th and 19th centuries reflect the intricate relationship between race, power, and resistance. Clothing was used to control and enforce social hierarchies, emphasizing the supposed inferiority of enslaved people. So on the right of this slide, you can see there's a screenshot of legislation that was passed in South Carolina in the early 19th century. And you can see it outlines the specific textiles that are deemed appropriate for enslaved people. And I'll just read some of the text there. So, Negro cloth, Duffields, horse gorseys, osnabrigs, blue linen, checked linen, coarse garlics and calicos, checked cotton, Scotch plaids, not exceeding the so it outlines all the different textiles that are deemed appropriate for enslaved people. And there was one caveat to this legislation. So domestics so enslaved domestics, people who worked in close proximity to their enslavers, like valets, coachmen, domestics, were allowed to wear finer textiles because those folks were representations of their enslavers' power. So, yet legislative dress codes were an awesomely ineffective attempt to maintain white authority and quell potential displays of agency or rebellion. So in another chapter in the book, I look at head wraps and I look at the ways in which women of color sort of balked legislation through their self-fashioning. So in this chapter, I'm looking at sort of enforced dress, but in other chapters in the book, I focus more so on Black agency. All right. So in this talk, I'm focusing on a specific textile called Lowell cloth, and Lowell cloth falls under the umbrella of Negro cloth. So Negro cloth was a distinctive marker of enslaved status, also known as homespun, slave cloth, or guinea cloth. These terms broadly describe cheaply made textiles that ended up on the backs of enslaved people. It was sometimes produced in Europe, such as in Osnabrück, Germany, or the Lake Districts of Wales, but also in New England, specifically Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Most enslaved people received their allotments of Negro cloth to hand sew their own clothing or ready-made Negro cloth garments once or twice a year. So Negro cloth typically was plain weave, typically cotton or linen or a cotton linen blend, sometimes manufactured in Europe, but more often manufactured in New England, in places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut. So in this next part of the talk, I'm gonna look at passages from slave narratives in which formerly enslaved people talked about the experiences of wearing Negro cloth. Not Lowell cloth specifically, but just Negro cloth more broadly. So Booker T. Washington shared the harrowing experience of wearing an uncomfortable flax shirt, emphasizing the enduring physical discomfort of these textiles. Harriet Jacobs emphasized the role of clothing in marking her identity as an enslaved person, and Frederick Douglass supported specific yearly allowances, highlighting the coarse hand of the clothing. So these are the three individuals that I just mentioned. Booker T. Washington on the left, Harriet Jacobs in the middle, and Frederick Douglass, of course, on the right. So Harriet, oops, sorry. So as mentioned, Negro cloth was durable at the cost of comfort. It was made to be long-lasting, given that enslaved people were allotted these textiles once and at most twice a year. Booker T. Washington included an especially long and harrowing description of wearing an unfinished shirt in his autobiography, Up from Slavery. And I'm just gonna read this passage, or try to at least. The most trying ordeal that I was forced to endure as a slave boy, however, was the wearing of a flax shirt. In the portion of Virginia where I lived, it was common, It was common to use flax as a part of the clothing for the slaves. That part of the flax from which our clothing was made was largely the refuse, which was of course the cheapest and roughest part. I can scarcely imagine any torture except perhaps the pulling of a tooth that is equal to that caused by putting on a new flax shirt for the first time. So I think that passage is really telling because you wouldn't expect that the putting on of a new shirt would be one of the most trying ordeals for an enslaved person, but it just shows you just how uncomfortable these textiles were. This passage reveals the daily sartorial indignities that enslaved people were subjected to. The uncomfortable flax shirt from his childhood was a grisly reminder of his former status as an enslaved person. So the next individual that I want to talk about is Harriet Jacobs. Orphaned at 6, Harriet Jacobs learned to read and sew from her enslaver, Margaret Horniblow. After Horniblow's death, Jacobs was given to her 3-year-old niece's father, Dr. James Norcombe, who effectively became her enslaver. Her time with the Norcombes was marked by neglect and mistreatment, illustrated by the linsey woolsey dress that she despised, considering it a symbol of her enslavement. So she writes, I have a vivid recollection of the linsey woolsey dress given to me every winter by Miss Flint. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery. The passage from her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, underscores the realization of clothing's role in marking her as an enslaved person, particularly the discomfort associated with the rough fabrics like linsey woolsey. This showcases how enslaved people asserted their humanity against oppressive social and legal codes. The use of coarse materials like Negro cloth emphasized their plight, symbolizing the efforts to confine and define them through sartorial norms. And the last individual that I want to talk about is Frederick Douglass. So most enslaved people received either allotments of Negro cloth from which they were responsible for hand sewing their own clothing, or Negro cloth ready-made garments, typically once or twice a year. Frederick Douglass reported that a field hand received a yearly allowance of 2 coarse linen shirts and 1 pair of linen trousers, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter, made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes. Children too young to work received 2 coarse linen shirts per year. According to Douglass, when their clothes were out, they went naked until the next year. So Frederick Douglass highlighted the limited clothing provisions for enslaved individuals, underscoring the connection between the history of textile production and the experiences of enslaved and formerly enslaved people. So in this part of the talk, the next part of the talk actually, I want to shift towards a specific city and a specific textile that was manufactured in the city called Lowell, Massachusetts, and the textile is called Lowell Cloth. So this is a map of Massachusetts, and I circled Lowell. And Lowell is about 45 minutes outside of Boston. Has anyone been to Lowell? Oh, okay. Oh my gosh. Wow. So I'm preaching to the choir. I'm going to tell you things. So you all know this already. Okay, cool. Well, if anyone hasn't been to Lowell, it's about 45 minutes outside of Boston. It's easy to get to, as you all know. You go to North Station and you catch the train headed towards Lowell. It's the last stop. It's a farmer industrial hub. Many of those farmer factories are still there. I would say it's a good day trip. If you're in the Boston area or if you're visiting Boston, you should go to Lowell and visit the mills that are still there. And one of them is still in operation, mainly for tourists. It's part of the National Park Service. And so you can see an operating mill. You can even buy some textiles from this mill. It's called the Boot Mill, I think it's called, BOOTT. And also what's interesting about Lowell is that it's the canals that sort of weave through the city because that's how they move the product from the factories to Boston and elsewhere. So it's a really interesting city. So I highly suggest visiting, not for you all because you've already been, but anyone watching virtually, visit Lowell. It's an interesting place. There's also a good quilt museum in Lowell, Massachusetts. Oh. Oh. Yeah, I didn't know that had been the American Textile Museum, and I know their papers or records have moved to Cornell, I think. But yeah, I guess that's where the Quilt Museum is now. That's where the American Textile Museum was, which is unfortunate that it doesn't exist anymore. But here's some of my own images from Lowell, Massachusetts. from the boot mill. What I really like about visiting the mill is that you really sort of get the tactile experience of being in a factory, the sound of the looms working, the racket. It's when you walk in the room, it's very loud. So much so that there's a history of this mill employing deaf people to work in the mills, and I think that would be an interesting project. Not for me necessarily, but for someone who might be in disability studies to look at the experience of deaf people in these mills. People who were born deaf, not people who were deafened by the machinery. So the remainder of this talk will focus on formerly enslaved people's recollections about Lowell cloth. Enslaved and formerly enslaved individuals refer to this textile as lowells or Lowell cloth, named after the city in Massachusetts where these fabrics were predominantly produced. Even when the textiles were manufactured elsewhere, they retained the name Lowell's, showcasing the prominence of this model of American industrialization. The city of Lowell was named after Francis Cabot Lowell, an industrialist and scion of the prominent Lowell family, who founded a successful textile mill in Waltham, Massachusetts. So Francis Cabot Lowell was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and he spent some time in the UK. And while he was there, sort of learned about textile production technologies and brought them back to the United States. The first mill that he and his cohort of businessmen set up was in Waltham, Massachusetts. And many of those mills are still there too. Not operating, but the structures are still there. And after they had success in Waltham, Massachusetts, they decided to start a new venture in Lowell, Massachusetts. And Lowell was chosen because of geological reasons. There are a lot of falls there. And so the water power can be harnessed for mills. And so they named the city after him because he spearheaded the effort. So though Francis Cabot Lowell passed away soon after, his model was replicated by shareholders in a city named after him. Giving rise to Lowell, Massachusetts, the affordable textiles associated with textiles made in his namesake became known as lowells or Lowell cloth. So what's really interesting is that if you're from the Boston area or from Massachusetts, the name Lowell is something you've probably heard many times. I think for people in the Boston area, it's a name that's associated with philanthropy or, the Lowells are like great New England family. The Lowells are known for their diverse members, including eminent figures such as poets Amy Lowell, James Russell Lowell, clergyman Charles Russell Lowell Sr., and Robert Trail Spence Lowell, Civil War hero Charles Russell Lowell III, and federal judge John Lowell, and the controversial Harvard University president A. Lawrence Lowell, whose great uncle was Francis Cabot Lowell. It's a lot of Lowells in that paragraph. And I actually taught at Harvard for 3 years, and what strikes me is that there's so many different Lowell place names. So this is a residential hall on the left, Lowell Hall, and then at the right is a lecture hall that's also Lowell, and there's also Lowell Street. So it's a name that people associate with accomplishment, philanthropy. People don't necessarily associate it with the experience of enslaved people. So that's one of the interventions that I'm making in this chapter, sort of rethinking this great New England family. Let's see if I can read this. While exploring the historical significance of Lowell's and Lowell cloth, one illuminating resource to address this inquiry is the WPA narratives, despite their pitfalls. The WPA narratives is a collection of interviews of formerly enslaved people compiled by the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s. However, it's important to acknowledge and navigate the challenges associated with these narratives. Has anyone ever used the WPA narratives before? Oh, yeah, great, awesome. A really just rich source. What I really always tell my students this, that they've all been digitized online. You can pull them up right now and read the WPA narratives, literally hundreds of oral testimonies of formerly enslaved people. That said, even though it's an important and rich resource that we should all be tapping into, they are problematic, which I'll go into in the next paragraph. They are rife with problems, including concerns about the accuracy of recollections from 60 years earlier, the use of white interviewers who were sometimes the sons and daughters of enslavers, grotesque transcriptions of Black speech patterns, and the illusion that interviews were transcribed verbatim when they were actually heavily mediated. Nonetheless, delving into these narratives provides valuable insights into the perceptions and experiences of those who refer to the textiles as lowells, and sheds light on the broader historical context surrounding this unique aspect of American industrialization. So the first figure that I want to focus on is Charlie Davenport. Charlie Davenport and others on the plantation where he was enslaved wore rough, low-cloth shirts, and during the winter, they wore linsey-woolsey pants and cowhide shoes, which were made in 3 sizes without a specific right or left shape, so they could be worn on either foot. What really strikes me about this passage, going back to what I said in the previous slide about we have to read these transcriptions critically, that first sentence really sticks out to me. Us wore low cloth shirts. And when I looked at the syntax of that sentence, it didn't entirely make sense to me, just thinking about Black Southern speech patterns. I'm from Louisiana and was raised around a lot of elders. And so when I saw the sentence beginning with us, I was like, that doesn't sound like the way I remember people speaking growing up. And I did a deep dive into like AAVE and like Black speech patterns, and that's not normal in African-American English. And so again, this is an example of the intervention of the interviewer. And I went down a long deep dive of the history of the interviewer and her sort of like ethnography and like her history of like folklore and creating folklore. And she was also a fiction writer. And so she sort of created sort of like these narratives. So that's not to say that this is inaccurate. I think it's accurate. I just think she sort of intervened in an effort to make the language seem more authentic. But that's not the focus here. We're focusing on the textile. Here again, low cloth is associated with discomfort, and shoes are described as awkward. That's something I see over and over again in the WPA narratives. Descriptions of shoes are always associated with discomfort. I don't focus on shoes in the chapter. And of course, in many places, enslaved people didn't wear shoes. Think about like New England. Of course, that wasn't, you had to wear shoes. The climate was just too cold. But in the Deep South and in the Caribbean, enslaved people often went shoeless. But when enslaved people did wear shoes, the shoes were very rough and very uncomfortable. And I see that in many of these narratives. So the second individual I want to focus on is James Lucas. So James Lucas recalled, when I was a little chap, I used to wear coarse low cloth shirts on the weekdays, and they was long and had big collars. And when the seams ripped, the hide would show through. When I got big enough to wait round at the big house and go to town, I wore clean, rough clothes. The pants were white linsey woolsey, and the shirts were rough, white cotton, what was wove at the plantation. And in the winter, the sewing women made us heavy cloth and knit wool socks for us. So it's interesting, this passage also has a Lowell Cloth reference, but it also has a Lindsay Woolsey reference, which is going back to the Harriet Jacobs passage. It's a textile that's often associated with enslaved people. He goes on to say, the women wore Lindsay Woolsey dresses and long leggings like the soldiers wear. This is a long, narrow cloth that wrapped round and round the legs and fastened at the top with the string. So again, what strikes me is that he made a point of saying coarse Lowell cloth. When Lowell cloth is described, it's described as being sort of a rough, uncomfortable textile. People often ask me what's a modern equivalent to Lowell cloth, and the only thing I can think of is maybe like burlap. It must have been that uncomfortable. And this is the last individual that I want to talk about, Ebenezer Brown. Ebenezer Brown was a man who was enslaved as a child in Amite County, Mississippi, in the last days of slavery. In his interview, he recalled memories of his enslavers, William F. McDowell and Hester E. Brown. Following emancipation, Brown and his family and others stayed on the same plantation as sharecroppers. Though lacking formal education, he and others taught themselves to read and write. And I just want to read this passage in full because I think it's really interesting. There are a lot of details here that I want to point out. When it rained, the women had to go to the loom house and work. They made all the jeans and lowells and cloth right there and dyed some of it with copperas and maple bark. Then women could make pretty cloth. That cloth never wore out. In them days, the women wore hoops and what were called balmorals. The white folks done it, and so did the slave women. So a lot of interesting things there. I mean, what jumps out to me is one, the reference to Lowell's, but also jeans, which I think denim is often associated with the late 19th century and Levi Strauss and the gold rush, but there's a longer history to denim that goes earlier in the 19th century. And of course, denim, or what was referred to as jeans, was worn by enslaved people as workwear throughout the 19th century. So that's interesting. Also think the natural dye references are interesting in this passage. Again, it's not something that I delve into in my research, but I think if someone's interested in natural dyes, it's interesting to think about all these references that you see to the ways in which enslaved people altered the color of clothing using natural dyes. I also think it's interesting that he makes a reference to hoops and balmorals. So he's talking about, he's referring to the 1860s and sort of this voluminous silhouette of the 1860s and describing the ways in which enslaved women replicated those fashions. So much so, a particular type of hoop skirt, which was popularized by the British royal family, sort of a sporty silhouette that they would wear at Balmoral in Scotland when they were vacationing. So it's really interesting that this formerly enslaved man and his friends and family on the plantation were attuned to fashion trends that were happening in the British Isles. And those trends made it all the way to rural Mississippi, which I think is really noteworthy. Also, and he says in the last passage, the last sentence, the white folks done it and so did the slave women. Also, what I find interesting is that, Ebenezer Brown says it, and also James Lucas says it, many of the textiles were produced on plantation grounds. And even when they were produced on plantation grounds, they were still referred to as lowells. So Lowell, Massachusetts had such a lack on the market that it almost became like a, what's it called? Proprietary eponym. Like Kleenex or Band-Aid or Xerox, any sort of textile that was worn or produced by enslaved people became referred to as Lowells, even when they weren't produced in Lowell, Massachusetts. But yeah, just to summarize, in inclement weather, the women worked in the loom house, producing a variety of textiles on a plantation and transforming simple textiles into more vibrant fabrics with natural dyes and mordants. So this is a concluding slide. These narratives highlight the profound connection between clothing and the identity of enslaved people, underscoring how textiles not only served as practical garments, but also as markers of enslaved status. The discomfort of these textiles, like the garments described by Booker T. Washington, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass, became symbolic of their daily challenges and sartorial indignities faced by enslaved people. Some Negro cloth, or better Lowell cloths, were produced in Lowell, Massachusetts, tying the experiences of enslaved individuals to a broader history of American textile production and global capitalism. So I'm going to end there. These are my socials. Feel free to give me a follow. And I've ended about 13 minutes early, so there might be time for a few questions, right?
And then also speak loud enough that everyone in the room can hear.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
My question is, when you're looking at the Civil War era, which you're basically concentrating on, what are we looking at as far as the fibers that they're using to produce this Lowell cloth? Because you didn't mention that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was mostly cotton or
Okay.
linen or a cotton linen blend.
Cotton and flax.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Hi, I actually had two questions. I was wondering, did this extend to all the undergarments as well? Were they always the Lowell cloth and uncomfortable under the uncomfortable shirt and pants? And the other thing is, I wasn't sure if I understood if all textiles in Lowell, Massachusetts were of this looser, was it like a looser weave fabric, or that was just one of many kinds of textiles made in Lowell?
Two good questions. Yeah, I don't know if I can answer about undergarments. It's hard to find information on the kind of undergarments that enslaved people were wearing or the undergarments that people were wearing in general. Like, we don't tend to speak publicly about those things. So I'm not exactly sure the kind of undergarments that enslaved people, and maybe someone here might know or might have more information about just how the nature of undergarments in the 19th century. I'm not entirely sure. But your second question was about, sorry.
Oh, hold on, sorry.
I just was wondering if was various textiles in Lowell, because I'm from Connecticut, but I know Lowell, but I don't know about the textiles there, or if it was just primarily this Lowell cloth.
Yeah, let's talk about that. In short, they were producing a variety of things in Lowell, Massachusetts. Negro cloth, which is one of many things. And when I've looked through records for the Lowell mills, there was rarely any reference to slavery or Negro cloth. Ever so often, you'll see like a small reference here and there and like a city directory. This mill makes Negro cloth amongst other things. But Lowell has sort of a lock on cheaply made, affordable textiles, Negro cloth, which is one of many things that they were producing. Another thing that I've seen is like carpets, sacking. These weren't fine textiles, they were sort of practical everyday textiles. But yeah, there were a variety of things being manufactured in Lowell, Massachusetts. And so there were several, of course, mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, including the Lowell Manufacturing Company. And the Lowell Manufacturing Company made Negro cloth. And sometimes I wonder if Lowell cloth is a reference to the city or to Lowell Manufacturing Company, or both. Be both.
We have an audience member who can answer the undergarment question.
Great.
Well, I'm not so sure about the undergarments. I did a lot of work in essentially slave cloth writ large, which was, oh, sorry.
Oh.
It's yeah, it's on the Journal of Early Southern Decorative Arts. It's online. But
No one could hear it online, sorry.
oh, I'm sorry. I did an article for Mazda on slave cloth a long time ago now, but it was part of a bigger project that Lynn Bassett and I did on the Civil War textiles. And so we spent a lot of time in museums and historical societies from New England down through this Georgia. And so I'd love to talk to you more about like the definitions of some of those textiles and stuff. I'd be happy to share, you know, what we painstakingly acquired in that time. But it seems to me in terms of what they wore, if they wore undergarments, they made them themselves. What they were given was outer garments. And they, like, so in Lowell, the equivalent today of what Lowell's was, the original Lowell cloth, was what we would now call muslin, like a heavyweight muslin. And that was, they called it sheeting or a shirting or, you know, things like that. So it, and they sold it overseas too. So anyway, it's not a real heavyweight rough, it's not real rough. But it definitely gets better with washing.
Oh, say your name.
Madeline Shaw.
She'll be speaking
No,
tomorrow.
this afternoon.
This afternoon, which is like tomorrow, but earlier. We
Thank
had
you, by the way, for writing that
couple
article.
more-
I cite it often, so.
Yeah, a couple more audience questions, and then we also have some online questions.
I'm Kathy Staples, and I'm speaking this afternoon on clothing in the South for African Americans. Do you have any sense that there's a regional component to the use of Lowell cloth? The slave narratives, for example, for Georgia and South Carolina don't mention that term at all. So do you think that perhaps, or I guess I would think or guess, that the states in which you find commentary on Lowell cloth, whether it's locally produced or produced in Lowell, is a product of transportation of the cloth, is a product of commerce, and that, for example, in Georgia and South Carolina, they didn't ever receive Lowell cloth. Have you ever thought about that, or do you have any thoughts about how that could be?
That's a great question, and I can't give you a definitive answer. The person who could answer that question is Seth Rockman. There's a book coming out. Well, it actually came out earlier this month called Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. And he has sort of combed through those business records and looked at the routes that agents took from places like Lowell and other mill towns to the South. And so I imagine, and I can't answer definitively, but the Lowell agents were going to Mississippi and Texas and Louisiana and maybe bypassing places like Georgia because they had other connections to other mills.
Coastal, we're talking about coastal states there.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, is that actually on?
It's not a microphone for the room, it's a microphone for virtual.
Oh, that's handy. So I think I can project better standing up. I'm Joe Paoletti. This is history on top of history. Back in the 70s, I did my master's thesis at University of Rhode Island on the woolen industry in Rhode Island, because the oldest woolen mill in the country is in Peacedale. And they produced what they called slave cloth, and they had agents in the Carolinas. So that may be, I think you're onto something, that it's whatever the label on the shipping container said, and they produced all wool. So
Is this the Hazard family?
Hazard, yeah, the
Yeah.
Hazard, yeah.
Yeah. And those records are digitized, and I think it's through Harvard
Well, of course
University.
they are. Of course they are now. If I could time travel, I could save myself a lot of time.
In regards to the certain kinds of cloth appearing in the South, et cetera, you have to look at your transportation system. A lot of the canals and the railroads ran east-west. How much actually went into parts of the South? So if you don't have transportation, you don't have goods. And so locally produced things would obviously be more available.
Mm-hmm.
And as to clothing, in men's shirts, are the tails not long enough to kind of sort of substitute for a covering of the private parts of the body? And so therefore, you would not necessarily have underwear, but you would have a layer between the skin and your outer pants.
Mm,
The consensus is that the shirt is the underwear.
Thank you. Two questions. What is linsey woolsey? Okay. And the other is, how did the Civil War affect the distribution of the cotton up north?
Absolutely. I mean, linsey woolsey, its composition is sort of in the name. It's a linen wool blend. And it's one of those textiles that's often associated with enslaved people, not exclusively. Other folks wore linsey woolsey as well, but it was a cheaply made sort of often coarse textile that ended up on the backs of enslaved people. And your question about cotton production and how the Civil War might have disrupted cotton production, absolutely, it was certainly a disruption. And I think about like the little that I've seen in the records in the Lowell cotton mills. There was a things shifted towards production of like for the war effort. So yeah, there was a disruption because of the Civil War.
Good morning and thank you, Doctor. We're talking about enslaved Africans taken from the continent of Africa. On the continent of Africa, I think that's where textile fabrication started. So these Africans, were they all stripped naked when they were deported from the continent of Africa? And do we know what type of fabrics they wore when they were in Africa?
But that's something I don't focus on in this chapter or in my research, but you're absolutely right. When Africans were enslaved, they were often stripped naked, one for health reasons, but also to strip them of their identity. And they were reclothed once they arrived in the Western Hemisphere. And so many of those enslaved Africans brought knowledge of textile production with them to the Western Hemisphere, whether it was in the United States or the Caribbean or places in Latin America. And in some cases, because of the Middle Passage was so catastrophic, some of that knowledge was forgotten or wasn't passed on to later generations. So yeah, I think what you're talking about is the passing down of knowledge from the African continent to the Western Hemisphere, which in some cases happened. Think about like indigo production. I think that's an example of like an African retention. But in other cases, the effects of enslavement in the Middle Passage were so catastrophic that a lot of things had to be relearned or some things were even forgotten. You're welcome.
Dr. Square, would you repeat the name of the book that recently came out
Yes.
and the name of the book and the author for everyone?
I'll actually be in conversation with this author on November 18th at Parsons, where I teach. But the author is Seth Rockman. He's a professor at Brown University. And the name of the book is Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. And I read an advanced copy of it. It's really good. You should buy it.
And Madeline, another one is, can you cite your article again?
Oh, good Lord, I wrote that years ago. It's called Slave Cloth and Clothing Slaves, and it's in the Journal of Early Southern Decorative Arts, and by me, Madeline Shaw, and it's online. Well, they can hear you, but people online can't.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The journal is MESDA, MESDA, MESDA Journal, and it is free online. You can read all the articles that have ever been published, and there are a lot of them. In fact, there are several on textiles of various subjects. But Madeline's is online there, and you just type in mesda.org. And then go to the journal and you'll be able to look and just type in Madeline Shaw and and the search engine will find the article.
And then we have a number of questions from online. So one question is, does any of the Lowell museums have any samples of the cloth?
Oh, What you can buy is at Boot Mill, they have newly manufactured textiles that approximate the kind of textiles that might have been produced in the 19th century. But actual samples aren't available in Lowell. What are available is the Baker Library at Harvard University has samples. And I'm trying to think of other places where you could see samples. I mean, it's a question that I often get, particularly for people who are more making oriented. They're very interested in like the weave, and they want to like replicate it some kind of way. But there aren't many surviving samples, because what are surviving samples are in the sampling books that agents would carry with them. But actual garments that enslaved people wore, because they were worn and because they weren't considered high value, they haven't survived. So you find samples in like the sample books, but not actual garments that enslaved people wore, except for a handful of examples that are in museum collections.
And do you have an idea of the cost of Negro fabric?
Oh, well, it was not expensive. I can't give you an exact figure, but it wasn't, I mean, to sort of supply an entire plantation, it could be costly, but it wasn't considered a pricey or expensive textile.
Couple of comments from our friends online. One, Lynn, who isn't able to join us, Lynn Bassett says, a comment rather than a question. Fabric called jean or jeans was often made with coarse woolen weft in the 19th century, so it would also be quite uncomfortable. So just because you love your jeans now doesn't mean they loved theirs. And then Pamela Whitcomb says, I wonder if the cloth was made from flax tow instead of long fibers. Tow is the stuff that breaks off from the flax when it is spun. I have some that I was going to make cord from. It's kind of spiky, and I can't imagine how uncomfortable that would be to wear. And cheaper.
I think the tow is the Booker T. Washington reference when he's talking about the refuse is an example of tow, or toe sacking.
So the Booker T. Washington shirt was most likely made of tow.
Tow is what is used to make ropes, so.
Susan says, Helen Bradley Foster's book, New Raiments of Self, uses slave narratives to talk about African-American clothing in the antebellum South. She has a few entries specifically about underwear listed in the index. So those underwear crowd, that's where you go. And just for our friends online, our friend Margaret has put the links for the MESDA in the chat. So you can do specifically MESDA or the past issues. And there you go. That's all our friends. Anybody else in person? All right, another question.
More of a comment. I've had the pleasure of going to England twice in the last year. And England is doing a very large look at their slave trade, and Manchester, particularly in looking at the mills there creating slave cloth for the American market. And there they have samples of the products that they were doing. So that's also a resource for people who are interested. And I think they were mainly servicing the Carolinas and Georgia.
I did a talk in Dundee. Well, I did it actually in Glasgow, but I went to Dundee while I was in Scotland. And honestly, I went there just to go to the V&A. There's a V&A in Dundee. It's like an offshoot from the London V&A. And while I was there, I realized there was a lot of overlap between the history in Dundee, which has a textile production history, producing like jute and other fibers and textiles. And you know, Frederick Douglass went to Dundee and like gave talks, and there's like there's a strong abolitionist wave there that was tied to sort of industrial workers sort of like sympathizing with the plight of enslaved people and seeing themselves in some ways being sort of enslaved to. In any case, just to add to what you said, there's a lot of interesting work happening in the UK, in Manchester, as you mentioned, but also in Scotland.
Just as an offshoot of this gentleman's statement about textiles from Africa, I would suggest that you look at the Indigo Girl, which goes into how the plantation people actually wanted, and they really needed the knowledge that on indigo that they had brought from Africa to the United States. and how that developed into an industry.
Is that a book or a documentary?
Yes, it's a book.
Book.
I don't know who it's from. I just read it in my book club. But it's very good and it's a really easy read, so you can get through it. I think you're right. Lucas Pickney.
Eliza.
We believe it came from from Hallie Bond, actually.
And of course, people have problematized that history, saying that actually, and maybe the book actually goes into this, but that it was enslaved people who brought that knowledge from the African continent. And so Eliza sort of appropriated that knowledge. And she's often credited for sort of innovating indigo production, but it might have been more of a dialogue between her and her enslaved people.
One more question from online. Were the shirts and pants manufactured also in the northern factories, or where were those created from the Lowell cloth?
Good question. In Lowell specifically, it tended to be just bolts of fabric that were shipped to the American South, and then enslaved people were responsible for hand sewing their own clothing. But there are examples of just sort of very basic garments, just long shirts, very basic trousers that were produced and given to enslaved people. Less so in Lowell, but in other places.
Sorry, they keep pouring in online. So we talk, Kay says, we talk about the influence of Africans in indigo quilts of the Poos collection, if that means anything to you. And then also several years ago, the New York Historical Society had an exhibit that had sample of linsey woolsey. We were allowed to touch it and it was very scratchy and thick. I cannot imagine how uncomfortable it would be to wear. And Jennifer says, looking prior to the Civil War, do we know what slaves were wearing in the Revolutionary War period and after?
Oh, wow, that's a very specific question. I don't know. I mean, after the American Revolution, enslaved people were more likely to wear textiles that were produced in the US. And they were more likely to wear textiles that were produced on plantations. Before, you were more likely to wear textiles that were produced in Europe and were shipped to the US or American colonies.
Kathy Staples again. That question actually should have a caveat or a qualification, because it depended where the enslaved person was in the North or South as to how they were clothed at any particular time period until emancipation. So that I have very well-dressed field hands in South Carolina in the early 18th century. And I have very poorly dressed field hands in Georgia after 1732. So it depends on the master, how much he or the mistress, how much the owner wants to spend, what the availability of any particular product is. But in Charleston, for example, in the 18th century, they were very well-dressed household slaves in and around Charleston and the Low Country. And some of them absented themselves from their owners and continued to dress very well. So it's very specific to plantation, to time period, to wealth and availability.
And also the individual. I think that's a good point that you're making, that you see a wide variety of, like, in terms of the dress of enslaved people, like you see, as you said, a very well-dressed enslaved people, but you also see cases in which the enslaver didn't.
Alden gets to go first.
There's several published pieces on what 18th century enslaved people were wearing, because we have all of those runaway ads, or now self-liberating, we call it, where, ran away from the subscriber, and this is what they were wearing, had on and took with them. So they often would wear several layers so they could wear as much as they could and just keep changing what they were wearing. And so we have a wide representation of examples of what they were wearing. Linda Baumgarten has written an article about that. I'm forgetting somebody else, maybe someone in this room, or somebody in this room probably knows the other one. I'm sorry? Martha Katz Hyman, of course, thank you. Becky Fifield has done a lot of work on runaway ads. I don't know whether that's published yet. I know she's, I'm sorry? More indentured, okay, more indentured than enslaved, okay, thank you. But there's a lot of work done on that if you want to do a little bit of digging. Sarah, yes, Susan?
You can't call it. You don't get to call it.
Oh, sorry.
So much of our early education, we're taught that stuff was produced here, grown here, woven here, sewn here. That's not necessarily true. In Virginia, there was a very large web, shall I use that word loosely, the Glassford merchants from Scotland. There were other smaller, lower class merchants that traded through Whitehaven on the west coast of England below the Scotch border. And there are tons, boats, yards, ells of cheap clothing. And there is some more expensive clothing, but in very small quantities. And a lot of that stuff is on microfilm, the Library of Congress. I worked on printed textiles and did not find much evidence in the microfilm merchants records that I used, but I did see a tremendous amount. And obviously if it was called, what's the German area? So, no, well, that area, but there's another one that begins, Slavery. That name was used to talk about linens, and the price was dirt cheap in comparison to other things. So there is a wealth of knowledge, and this is before the revolution, but I'm sure that trade, despite embargoes, was reinstituted after. But in Virginia, you have 4 major waterways so that they could go up to the fall line in the ships. So there was a transportation web there, and the merchants were very, very tied.
All right, here's what we're going to do. We have a couple more questions from online, and if you have comments, we're going to wait till the break, and you can comment all you want. Oh, they are comments from online. All right, just one more comment from online from one of our speakers who's not able to be here. Becky Fifield's research, which does allow runaway slaves, is available as a database on the American Antiquarian Society. Thanks, Lynn.
It's funny, I find less references to Lowell Cloth in the runaway slave ads for some reason. A lot of those databases are keyword searchable. And sometimes you find like 1 or 2 references, but they're not copious. It's more so in the WPA narratives for some reason.
Thank you so much.